Hi, Misha here, and last time when we were looking at German armor, German tanks, we talked about the Panzer III, the Kfz.141, and the Panzer IV, the Kfz.161. Well, in 161/1 and 161/2, because German's in designations. Today, well, tonight, when I'm recording this, we're going to talk about what was supposed to be their replacement. The Kfz.171, known as the Panther, also early on referred to as the Panzer V or Panther V, but that was dropped. Yeah, some very good, some very bad about this tank. Some consider it to be the best tank of World War II. Those people are wrong. However, it was also not a steaming pile of crap, so let's get into it a bit. And we'll use these 172 scale die-cast models. They're nothing fancy, but they're good little example pieces with moving turrets and stuff, so that's kind of neat. Why not? The first one on the spinny thingy, and for once with the German design, we don't have a ton of variants. There's just the Ost D, Ost A, and Ost G, really. There was to be an F, but it never got out, though, the prototype stage. But we need to go back before World War II. In 1938, the earliest plans were being considered for the replacement for the Panzer III and Panzer IV. And this was known as the Kv-20 program. It was for a 20-ton tank, medium tank, to replace them. And you had all the names involved: Krupp, MAN, Daimler-Benz, so on and so forth. However, this design was quickly discarded after 1941 when the Germans faced the reality of Allied tanks, namely Russian. A new program, the Kv-30, for a 30 to 35 ton tank was started, and Krupp took a look at the specs and said, nope, we're out, pretty much leaving it down to Daimler-Benz and MAN. So in 1942, that winter and early spring, they evaluated the concepts, and actually the Daimler-Benz design, which was a diesel power, kind of interesting for German stuff, was originally favored by Hitler, Speer, and others. However, Heinz Guderian, who was still very much involved here, set up a commission, and after some consideration and some refinement to the MAN design that MAN had done through a little bit of industrial espionage, in May it was decided to go with the MAN. And that's where we get the Panther. Now, the Daimler-Benz would have probably been a better tank, but it would require a new turret and a new engine be developed. The MAN used an existing turret design by Rheinmetall, and it used the same engine as the Tiger I, which was actually good. The Tiger I was a very heavy tank. This was going to be much lighter, so speed, mobility would go way up. Another thing, studying the T-34 had become a pastime by a lot of Germans, and they decided that A, its 76mm gun was actually quite useful for armor-piercing and high-explosive. It was kind of that sweet spot, they felt. And B, hey, this idea of sloped armor has some merit to it. As we know today, of course it does. So these elements of the T-34 were in the design. So a contract was awarded, and the first prototype, built from mild steel or boilerplate if you're French, was ready in September, and MAN was supposed to go immediately into production, but there was a shortage of the correct tools and jigs and material they needed at the factory. So they had to wait. And if things are already kind of iffy now, in 1942, even before Kursk, D-Day, all that, you can imagine how they're going to get in years to come. Nevertheless, the first tanks roll off the production line in December, and the first divisions are established in January and February. of 1943. Other factories are also brought on board to build these, although they never are able to even come close to the numbers that the Hitler and his buddies want. Worse, the first tanks have so many flaws and QC issues. Between March and really June, there's a couple of different programs where they have to go back to the factory and have things repaired. Think of it as a day one launch computer game that has a game-breaking bug that you have to download a patch for. Now imagine doing that with multi-ton tanks. So it really wasn't until June, late June, 1943, that the very first version, known as Ost-D, was, at least on paper, ready to go. So let's talk about the design a bit. Hi, Misha from the future here, interjecting. I did find a model in 1/72 scale of the Ost-D. There are about 850 of these built between January and September of 1943, and the first 250 had the original engine. The rest would have the slightly uprated petrol engine. But I just wanted to interject and show a few little differences. Note that it does not have the front machine gun ball in the hull. It does have a front machine gun, but it's under a mailbox flap. It also has the original forged cupola on the turret. Later they would go to the cast style that has the third mount for a machine gun as an option for aerial defense. Those are the two big differences. It still has the very effective 7.5 centimeter main gun. It would have had the non-ventilated engine compartment, original running gear system. This one does have the side skirts still installed, and it even has the mud guards installed, so it's got kind of everything. But this would have been one of the early, not so reliable versions. There would be a lot of other changes introduced, but most of them are either internal or part of the gear and the transmission and wheel system. These models from Dragon are quite detailed, but they are kind of light. They don't use much metal in them, so it's kind of a mixed blessing. You do get a moving turret and the moving gun though, although this one droops. It really likes to sit on its rest. But I like being complete, and I wanted to show you one of the early versions in true form before they went to the Ost-A, which the other two models I have are an example of. So with that, we'll go back to Misha from the past. By the way, it's stormy here if you couldn't tell. Now this model here is either of a very late D or an early A. And yeah, the D series came before A. The basic tank started off at 35 tons, but then Hitler wanted armor added, the gun was increased. We ended up with about a 44 to 45 ton tank, and some later versions with different packages and armor could even get more than that. It's bigger than the previous Panzers, but not ginormous, not counting the gun. We're about 22.5 feet long. We have a crew of 5, standard, 3 in the turret, 2 in the hull. And, like I said, it has the same engine as the Tiger. Now, the first 250 had one engine, and the rest had a slightly improved model. It actually had quite respectable mobility. Early on, before the weight really went up, it could get to over 50 kilometers per hour. After some stuff was added and changed, it was down to about 45, 46 kilometers per hour. Still faster than the previous Panzers, though. and still faster than the Tiger. It had some other things. For one thing, it had a dual torsion bar suspension system, and it had a deep weighting kit. It had an engine compartment that was made waterproof. That didn't work out so great. But really, the mechanics were not the good things about it. The good things were the armor and the armament. The star of this tank is its 7.5 centimeter main gun here. This is a very long gun, which is good. Even though it's only 75 millimeters, doesn't sound that impressive, it actually was one of the most powerful tank guns of World War II. In some ways, even more powerful than the 8.8 centimeter gun that the Tiger I had. This had higher velocity, so better penetration, although the Tiger's gun had better potential destruction if it penetrated its target. So, it was actually quite accurate, and it had the benefit of good German optics, at least some of the tanks did. It carried around 80 shells, give or take the exact model, usually a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive. The downside there, the way shells were stowed in the tank, yeah, they were a bit of a boom hazard. But either way, early versions had 2 MG-34s, one in the front hull, one coax mounted. Later versions had a third added to the cupola for the commander for close defense or even anti-aircraft. It's actually one of the first tanks where you kind of see the placement like that. Not a bad idea, really. And worth pointing out that the early D model, instead of having a ball mount, it was actually what they call the mailbox flap. So just an armored flap that opened up and stuck it out. But with the A model, they would introduce a much more interesting solution. So yeah, the gun was quite interesting and one of its best features. Another thing, the front armor was sloped at about 55 degrees. It was 80 millimeters thick, meaning effectively it had very good resistance. The turret would go up to 100 millimeters, also angled. So the front and turret armor was very respectable. It could actually take a hit up to about a 90 millimeter round. You know how tanks go, get lucky hits and everything, but, reasonably so. It could potentially repulse a Sherman's, especially the original 75 or the older T-3476. So that's the good gun, good front armor. The bad, though, and this is what we'll probably talk about for a lot of this video. To keep the weight reasonable and mobility decent, sacrifices had to be made. The side armor was the weak point. Depending on the model, it was about 40 to 50 millimeters, which, pre-war and early war wasn't bad, but at this point in the war, 1943, 44, 45, pretty thin. Now, we do have these side skirts, which, as we talked about in the Panzer video before, they're not really meant to block penetration, just deflect or deform anti-tank rounds. Of course, they have some downsides too, making maintenance more difficult. So side armor is weak, and the back armor isn't very strong either, and the roof armor, the top armor, is very thin, as little as 15 millimeters. So from the top and sides, not well armored, but from the front, well armored. And the whole idea was, because of this nice gun, it was to engage targets at distance and just outrange them and use its mobility, speed, and maneuverability to get the best. One fun thing, the original turret had a pretty good turn rate, but in production they actually introduced a high speed gear to really spin it quickly. And it was a pretty easy turret to adjust and to do so with pretty good degree of accuracy. So they did their best to get the gun on target as quick as possible. So that is our tank. Now, it was put into combat for the Battle of Kursk, Operation Citadel. In fact, the whole operation had been delayed 2 months until enough Panthers were available. The decision was Hitler's. It was probably not a good one. Hitler making a bad tactical decision. Crazy, I know, right? The idea, he wanted to use these and have enough, so he wanted 200, 250 available at least for this offensive. Now, they were still only going to be a small part of the Kursk event. Germany had about 2,700 tanks and other armored vehicles there. And they were only able to get 200 Panthers ready, and most of these were just freshly back from their day one patch, so they wouldn't crash. Well, of the 200, a couple already broke just trying to get them off the trains, and by broke, I mean they caught fire. One early thing that they found out, yeah, there were a lot of gasoline and oil leaks that, kind of caused them to catch fire on their own. Part of it was they had sealed up the engine compartment so it could go through water too well, but part of it was just shoddy QC. Also, potential sabotage. At this point, there's some unpopularity going around. Further tanks would drop out or not be available, meaning that when the offensive really started on July 5th, 6th, there was only about 184 available. And if the tank had just bowled over the Russians, that would have been great. But, during those 2 months, they weren't just sitting there with their thumbs up their borscht. They were building their own tanks, and they were laying down defenses like minefields. So that bought Russians time too. And when they get into the thick of it, the Panther, it was a rush job, and it showed. It broke down at crazy levels. In fact, at one of its lowest points, not even a week into the fighting, it was estimated that only about 10 were still left operational. Of course, the number would go up. The repair corps was actually doing a bang-up job, hauling these off the field, bringing them back and repairing them, especially considering they had virtually no spare parts. So, credit there. They really did their best to keep these tanks running. And they suffered from many other issues, too. And they can make a whole video talking about it. They had transmission troubles. They had final drive troubles. They had really trouble with just the crews not having had time to train on them. And a lot of the crews were relatively new besides. Just good grief. Pretty much everything. It was a raw thing that had no time. It went straight from first production run into one of the heaviest, nastiest combats humanity's ever had. It wasn't a complete loss. The gun actually proved very good. It had good range, good penetration. It was the first time the Germans really could take on the newest Russian tanks with confidence. Also, the front armor did really well. Of course, the side armor was still a problem. And it was far from enough to tip the battle. On July 17, Hitler ordered an end to the fighting and to regroup, although it would actually take several days, and the Germans would continually fight a retreat action throughout July and August, meaning more and more tanks were lost. In the end, over 3/4 of the Panthers sent there were lost. Now, a few were sent in as reinforcements later, but still yet, well over 150 were lost at Kursk. And many of the issues were, of course, revealed. So not an auspicious start, but I will say that in September, we switched from the Ost D to the Ost A, and that does have some noteworthy improvements. For example, the machine gun going to a ball mount, adding this ring for the machine gun on top here. They would work on the engine, the transmission, other mechanical things, just ironing out bugs. Problem is that with the design, to repair part of the tracks, the running gear, the wheels. You had to just dismantle everything, including these skirts, making it more difficult. This is a highly complicated wheel system, suspension. It is difficult to repair. On top of that, if you needed to get to the transmission, a part that was known for not being especially reliable, you had to disassemble the driver's compartment and then pull the entire transmission out of the tank. So, yeah, pretty typical German. And quality control was improved. So with the Ost A's, things were looking up. And then in March of 1944, the final major version, the Ost G, would come along. It would have improved armor, especially a little bit better orientation for the sides. It would also correct some issues to do with the mantlet becoming a bullet trap and killing the crew. Little things like that. And it was the most refined version. In fact, Heinz Guderian was rather in praise of it, saying that they'd pretty much fixed every major bug with the G. Now, there were plans to further improve it that were the Ost F, known as the Panther II. This is why the A's and G's didn't show major improvement, because they were just holding them, hopefully for a whole new refined version. But it never came to be because of, well, how the war was going for the Germans at this point. But it continued to see heavy combat and use, and really did earn a name for itself. Credit where credit's due. For a change of scenery, let's put the other one on, the spinny thing. Notice this one doesn't have the side skirts. They are often damaged or torn off in the field, or they were removed because they had to be for maintenance and just never reinstalled. Also, it has the extended fenders or mud guards on the front here. They could be removed too and stowed if not needed. Otherwise, it's basically the same model. But, yeah. In fact, this was the third most produced armored tracked vehicle that Germany had of the war. So even though it came late, they built a lot of these. Actually, more than the Panzer III. They built roughly 6,000 Panthers. So, not, once they got up and running, they did build them in great numbers. They would continue to fight. In fact, the majority were sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians. But that was a meat grinder throughout the rest of 43 and into 44. When the Allies landed in Normandy, there were about 750 tanks available there, and a good chunk were Panthers, but a much smaller number. Now, they would send more over to reinforce them that July and August. About the most Panthers that ever engaged the Allies there at D-Day were a little over 400 at any one given time. And they would reach their maximum strength in Russia that September with a little over 500 operational. There'd be more in theater, but they wouldn't always be running. And there would be over 300 at the Battle of the Bulge in December. So they started to be available, but of course, almost as quick as they could build them, the Allies could blow them up. And they still suffered from mechanical issues. The final drive system never was perfect. And what we start to run into in 1944, see, early 44 spring was kind of the high water mark. With the late A's and the G's, the bugs have been worked out. But if you go much past that, especially post D-Day, then you start to run into supply issues. The Nazis are running out of raw materials. They're running out of alloys, including molybdenum, which is an alloy insert to strengthen steel. Ask Sweden how well things work if you don't have it. They also run out of ball bearings at one point in late 1944. And just the quality of the workers at the factories goes way down. Plus, the factories are being constantly bombed and repaired ad hoc. And on top of that, the crews for the Panther are increasingly young and ill-trained. So they just don't have the tactics. For example, in September, October of 1944, Patton's Army just made lunch meat out of these, even though he still was using a lot of older M4 Shermans with the original 75mm gun, a tank that on paper is inferior to the Panther. Yeah, it didn't work out that way. Good leadership and whatnot. The British had the Sherman Firefly, which I have done a video on in the past, and that did give the Panther a run for its money. Its 76mm 17-pounder gun was nearly as good as the Panther's. Really, the area the Panther was still superior was accuracy and just aiming. The Firefly was exactly what it was, kind of an ad hoc conversion of a M4, so there were some kind of downgrades. The quality of these went way down towards the end of 1944, and mechanical breakages started to go up again. One thing, because of the lesser grade steels used, the armor plates were much more prone to cracking and shattering. A study conducted by the Americans after D-Day of the captured Panthers, at least 2/3 showed cracking of the armor plates, even after just a moderate hit from something that should not have penetrated. And of course, this would extend to things like the very complex torsion bar suspension, the wheels, everything. And some economies are starting to be made. Things deleted, saving money where they can. So by 1945, the quality is dipping way down again. And it really does show. Nevertheless, they fought on, of course, as we know. Towards the end, in February and March, in the East, Germany was able to muster 300 to 400 Panthers at any time, but that's really only because they transferred the ones that were in the West over that winter, leaving very few. Fighting in the West was a little different. In the East, in the open steppe, the tank could really take advantage of its speed and long-range gun. And in the West, when you had areas like that, it could do the same. But a lot of France was heavily foliated, hedgerows, cities, villages, towns. In those areas, the Panther really couldn't draw upon its strengths. In fact, it would get bogged down, stuck, broke down, and Allies quickly learned of its weakness and would just come at it from the sides. And it didn't take a whole lot to punch through one from the side, and because of how the ammunition was stowed, if you could do that, there was a good chance you could make it explode. In fact, some areas, it was actually considered that the Panzer IV showed better in 1944 in the West than the Panther. So, yeah, that probably explains why the Germans went ahead and transferred them over to the Russian front, where they were able to have a little better success. But it was always a stalling action. The factory would continue to build these at least through March, but thanks to bombing raids and supply shortages, they were down to just a few dozen a month. And of course, even though nearly 6,000 were built, the vast majority were lost in the war. One fun thing, after the war, 1946, the British requested that 9 be assembled from existing parts by German workers in occupied West Germany, and they obliged. And so the final Panthers were actually built for the UK for testing purposes. Kind of fun. So was it good? Was it bad? Well, yes to both. Much like with the Tiger and Tiger II, the Panther 1-on-1 was a very good tank when it was running up against a British tank, say a Churchill, or an American tank, say a M4 Sherman. But it was very expensive to produce. It required specialist tools, specialist resources, and it was a nation losing a war. On top of that, the Germans just couldn't help themselves to over-engineer things, again, namely the drive system, the suspension, and they were still using gasoline versus diesel engines. That's the thing. it just wasn't the right tank for that. And of course, it was rushed in so much that there was no time to revise it. Looking at other German stuff, tanks, planes, even guns, they typically had the first couple of production series, OS, A, B, C, even through D and F, is kind of trials or pre-production styles. That's why you usually see F and Gs and whatnot as the actual production models. But here, we don't even get that. That said, the armor, at least the front armor, was going in the right direction. And the main gun was a really good main gun. So that's the strengths. And even though it required a lot of resources, it was still a much better place to put your marks than in the Tiger II. And that's evidenced by the fact they were able to crank out so many in just over 2 years. So something has to be said for that. It wasn't as costly as the Tigers, at least. But, you know, I don't really think it's the best tank at all of the war. Maybe the best German. Although, again, the late Panzer IVs were pretty good. But the place where the Panther really excels is the front armor versus those. If it had been involved better and if it was better in the field for servicing, maybe. At least it shows them learning lessons, not just sticking to the old. You look at what Japan was doing in 1943, this is a lot better, and German industry was able to keep up a lot better. And as I've said before in these videos, I am in no way an expert on German stuff. I just like doing these because they're fun. So you can let me know what you think. But we had to cover the Panther, the last of the German battle tanks, the last medium tank, which means next we have to talk about the heavies. So that's going to take us back in time a bit. But that's next time. For now, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.